Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I'm here today to take a look at the image quality from the new Canon. This is an EF-S, which means it's for Canon's crop sensor or APS-C cameras. So it's an EF-S 35mm f2.8. This is the macro IS, and it has an STM focus motor. If you missed my first look at it, I'll break down some of the details of the build quality in that episode, and also give you kind of a preview of what I'm talking about when I begin to refer to the macro LED lights that are built into this lens as a part of what I'm going to look at in the image quality. Of course, what a lot of you want to know, probably above all else, is how good is the image quality? Well, let's take a look together and let's find out how good it actually is. All right, well, let's start by taking a look at the sharpness from the lens. So what I've done here is I have mounted the 35mm f2.8 macro IS on a Canon 80D body. Then I've also, for a comparison point, I have loaded on the Canon 35mm f1.4 L. And so just a quick little bit to note here. Of course, the L lens is stopped down a little bit. Well, it's actually stopped down 2 full stops by this point. So you can see it has 0 vignette, whereas the macro lens here has a bit of vignette that's showing up here. Also, you will note that the Canon L lens, it actually frames a little bit wider than what the EF-S lens does, and so you know, it could be that this one is a little bit short of 35mm, or this is a little bit longer, but just to note a few subtle differences there. Looking at these images as a whole, if you discard the difference in the, shading towards the perimeter and look more towards the middle, we're going to find that globally they look fairly similar. Now, if we look at a pixel level here towards the center, we're going to find that there is a little bit more contrast and sharpness for the full frame L series lens. Not necessarily surprising. It is a near $2,000 lens compared to a $350 lens. But I think the takeaway thing here is that, it shows that really this lens is pretty sharp if it is, within the conversation here with a lens that is one of Canon's optical best, and certainly at this focal length is Canon's very best. Now, if we move out towards the edges of the frame, you can see that there is kind of some little bit of a haze, a little softness, lack of contrast that starts to bleed into the EF-S lens, whereas the L lens, particularly stopped down 2 stops, it's sharp right out to the edge. So looking at f4, we see that now the vignette has basically disappeared, and so now our kind of basic exposure looks pretty much identical between the lenses. Looking at them globally, you can see there's a little bit more contrast for the L series lens, but once again, the image look here is more similar than different. Let's jump into the center once again, and now we're going to find that while there is a very minute advantage for the Canon lens, and it shows up more in just the contrast, the textures have a little bit more resolution to them. Truth be told, again, this image quality is more similar than different. And if we look out towards the edge of the frame, we find that now the EF-S lens, it's carrying that sharpness out better towards the edge of the frame. We'll look at this side, and whereas before we were starting to see some softness here, it is a hair softer than what the L lens is, but it is now quite close. So just a quick look comparing f2.8 to f4 on the EF-S macro lens. And looking towards the edge of that frame, you can see that there is a considerable difference with it stopped down to f4 here. You can also see a pretty drastic difference in the vignette here, particularly that shows up here in the foreground. So now stop down to f8, one final comparison here globally. There's still a bit more contrast here on the L series lens, but again, they're pretty close here. And now if we look at them, I do like the contrast a little bit better on the L series glass, but I think that bottom line here is that you're getting pretty amazing bang for your buck in terms of sharpness with this EF-S lens. There's nothing to be concerned about there. All right, now a few images at closer to macro distances, and I shot this in the Angler Portacube LED light tent that I reviewed a few months back. And so you can see, without any editing at all, beautiful color rendition here, lots of detail, no problem there. Moving in a little bit closer here, and so on this cherry, you can see that we're definitely pumping in here pretty close. And so once again, we see a very nice detail showing up there. And so it does function definitely as a true macro lens. And it's a 1-to-1 macro, very nice detail, very nice color rendered at macro distances. So sharpness is certainly not a problem. Here's just a few more shots out in the real world, and so this also gives you an idea of how it bleeds towards defocus, which I'll comment on more in just a second. This is a handheld macro shot, but as you can see, it's doing its job, and we've got very nice detail there. Here at even closer to macro distance, and you can see that I have turned on the built-in LED light to help these little water droplets to pop out even more. But very nice detail. I mean, pixel, kind of grain or visibility is a little bit heavier in APS-C, so it's not as magically smooth as some of my full-frame images, but this is doing a fantastic job. Another thing to note here is that there's a ton of potential in this image for chromatic aberration, and I'm not really seeing it, and so that's definitely a bonus there, that we have a nice clean result. Here's just a little bit further out, and so once again, great detail here, and looks nice and crisp. No further editing. The bokeh circles look nice and round, and this is a 7-bladed round aperture, and so even stop down, you're going to get pretty nice results with that. Here's another lens to show background, and so here we're more working at it's fairly close to the subject, obviously for a 35 millimeter, or in this case, that's a 56 millimeter equivalent on a full frame. But you can see that the background still looks nice and soft. Image quality is really quite good from this lens. Stopping it down to use as a, kind of a general purpose lens produces nicely detailed results. As you can see here, here's another example here. Someone got a little bit stuck out in the woods, but you can see a nice color rendition, nice detail. It works fine as a general purpose lens. Once again, at closer to macro distances, this is another handheld macro. Lots of great detail there, and so, image quality is quite nice from this lens. Now, this is the kind of the limit of how far you can go before the background starts to get a little bit busy. This is a few feet away from him, and so you can see great detail here, nice contrast. I do want to point out the lens has quite nice contrast. Even down in this area that could, trend towards busyness, I think it does a pretty good job of keeping things nice and soft. Here's another example here, and so this great detail up here obviously on the daisy, but in this kind of image, you don't really have a whole lot of depth before you start hitting these other daisies. This stuck up a little bit higher, but you can see that how at macro distances it's still doing quite a nice job of blurring out other backgrounds. However, this is where things will start to fall apart compared to longer focal lengths, and that is that you don't get as much compression out of the lens. And so in this case, I was a few feet away from the subject, and there wasn't a lot of depth to the background, and so here you get a much busier background that is less about the quality of the bokeh, which is still really quite good, and more about the nature of the focal length that really doesn't have the ability to compress all that much, and because it only has a moderately wide aperture, maximum aperture of f2.8, it's not going to create a ton of blur. Here, also at f2.8, you can see what I'm talking about. Now, at the same time, there's nothing objectionable about this. The quality of the blur is fine. It actually is quite good. The difference is here, however, is that there's not necessarily a lot of it. And so, our subject, nice detail on my youngest son here, and everything looks good. Detail is great there. But as you can see, there's not a great deal, although there's depth in the scene, there's not a great deal of of kind of background blur. And so you're not going to get as much three-dimensional pop as you would with something with a wider aperture. And that's also part of the nature of APS-C. Now for a couple of moments here, we'll take a look at the difference made by the built-in LED light. And so I'm going to show you a series of shots where I'm going to run through some of the different settings on the light. Here is a setup without the light on, and then we'll compare when we turn the light on. And so you can see down towards the bottom portion of the image, you can see some of the curvature that comes from the, the twin ring lights. And so I'll throw them side by side for you. So here is without the ring light, here is with the ring light. No other settings changed, exact same shutter speed, it was on a tripod, nothing else changed. And so you can see that it is not a massive amount of light, but it is enough to add a little bit of fill. So here it is with it full power. Again, same settings throughout this series. And here it is at the half power setting. And here it is with it completely off. And so just go back through those with it off, half power, and full power. So it certainly makes a difference. And of course, this is at very close macro distances here. This is the new Sigma 24-70 f2.8 art lens. And so you can see we've got a very narrow depth of field there. However, it makes a difference, but it's not necessarily a massive one. Now, a few other options here. This is with the left side light only engaged, and then switching to the right side. In this case, the right side was a little bit closer. So again, left side and right side. So it shows that you can change up the lighting a little bit depending on which side you have powered on. Now here, once again, just for the sake of comparison, here's a shot without. And so the purpose here of turning that light on, of course, is to illuminate inside. Now with a reflective surface, when you're very close to it like this, there's pros and cons. And obviously you can see what the con is. On a reflective surface, we are getting, maybe a little bit more busyness to the lens. So there's with it off, there's with it on. Another series where we go a little bit further out, and so there it is with it off, and now with it on. So you can see, particularly in the inside of the lens where it was quite shadowed, it definitely opens that up and reveals more detail inside, but at the cost of having a very close light surface that is reflected there. One more, a little bit further out, we're trying to see how effective, how long it will stay. And so here's without it on, and here is with it on. And so now our reflection is a little less distracting, and it's still doing a good job of lighting up the interior, but at, only a little over a foot away, you can see that, it's not a massive amount of light. Off and then on. And if we move out, this is closer to 2 feet now. Here's it with it off, and here's with it on. And so again, it definitely makes a difference, but you can see that difference basically right across our subject. And if you look at this area here, let's just zoom into it. This is an area that is pretty much in shadow, and you can see just a little faint band of light that comes through it. But again, in terms of illuminating the interior of the tent, it's certainly not enough power to do that. So let's take a look at flare here, wide open. You're going to see that there isn't any kind of huge ghosting pattern. However, there is a little bit of veiling that's coming down off of this at wide open. If we stop that down to f11, you can see there is a little ghosting pattern here. It's not strongly pronounced, and it's not an objectional kind of coloration. The veiling here has, for the most part, vanished. There's still a little bit there. But again, this and this is, it's reasonably artistic, and so it's not, to me, terribly destructive. And of course, then if you, depending on how you place it, and I find that if you learn to be creative with how you place bright light sources, you can really kind of maximize the artistic potential, for example, like this. So we've got just a little bit of a ghost pattern there at f11, but not bad. And in my opinion, this 7-bladed aperture actually produces a pretty fantastic looking sunburst here. And here is it shown off even a bit more. So even more light bursting through here. And so it's all localized. And that's the thing. I mean, I think that our contrast elsewhere in the image looks good. And so this I can live with for sure because it has artistic merit and it's not all that destructive to the image. And then just one final thing, let's take a look at the distortion, which of course in a lens like this, even though it's a wider focal length, it's pretty important that it not have a lot of distortion. Otherwise it kind of destroys its functionality for macro purposes. And good news here, that should be a straight line, and it looks pretty straight to me. So as you can see from a closer look at the image quality, there's a whole lot to like here, particularly in a lens that is really so relatively inexpensive at only $349. And so while the build isn't all that amazing, the optics inside, they are pretty fantastic. And so stay tuned for my final review when I'll break down some of the other aspects and kind of give you an overview of the lens at large. So we'll look at the how effective the built-in image stabilization is. We'll take a look at the autofocus. We'll take a look at how the lens performs kind of in relation to its price point, and I'll give you a final verdict whether or not this is a lens that you should consider for yourself. I'm Dustin Abbott, and if you haven't already, you can follow me on social media. You can become one of my patrons at my Patreon account. And of course, you can find linkage in the description down below to an image gallery for this lens, along with some buying links if you'd like to purchase one for yourself. If you haven't already, please click that subscribe button. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.